Indigenous people are caught in a welfare trap, which can be identified in the legacies that have come from past practices. Pre-European occupation involved a range of practices, including establishing missions, which have had a lasting negative impact on Indigenous Australians. When European people arrived in Australia, their perceptions of the Indigenous population were that they were not as human as white people. This construction included seeing Indigenous people as exotic natives, which meant not equal respect to white people. The European colonisation involved many violent battles between European and Indigenous peoples, which ended with many Indigenous lives being lost. Indigenous Australians experience a greater rate of socio-economic disadvantage, with some of the causes located in historical practices. Indigenous Australians are more likely to live in a low-income household compared to non-Indigenous. Across a 5-year period, an Indigenous person is not only more likely to stay as the bottom part of the income distribution, but is more likely to fall outside the top distribution. The graph compares Indigenous to non-Indigenous household income levels. The data that reports on Indigenous income is focused on material poverty and tends not to account for non-material levels of poverty. The Australian Institute of Family Studies describes Indigenous non-material poverty as including the loss of children through their removal, the loss of identity, spiritual and cultural heritage, the loss of contact with the land, and the loss of dignity and self-respect through oppression over the years. The message from all this data is that poverty is just as real in our country for Indigenous Australians as it is in developing countries. There are these key issues because many human service social work practices are not culturally aware and are not allowing Indigenous people to get involved in policy decisions in their local area. Many schools across Australia do not incorporate Aboriginal history into their classes and do not take the time to learn their stories. In society, many people are scared to talk to Indigenous people and are intentionally excluding them every day in simple things. Indigenous Australians are especially vulnerable to poverty, which makes them more likely to need access to mental health, employment, and education services. Thus, Indigenous Australians create massive issues in social work practices as they experience many forms of poverty. Due to many Indigenous communities still existing in locations of the missions and reserves, intergenerational trauma continues to be experienced by Indigenous Australians due to how they were constructed and treated from colonisation to contemporary times across a range of areas: education, health, housing, disability, and addiction. This is an ongoing issue for Indigenous people relating to their poverty. In order to combat the issues of poverty for Indigenous Australians, we need to focus on building relationships, holistic approaches, involvement by Indigenous community members, valuing Indigenous knowledge, and adopting the strength-based perspective. One way on addressing these issues is by building relationships with the Aboriginal community by establishing and maintaining contact with families. Another one is attending community events such as NAIDOC Week activities and learning more about Aboriginal history. Doing so requires a level of knowledge that includes enough complexity to understand the causes of some of the challenges that face Indigenous people today. Working well with Indigenous people involves a focus on relationships and process. The best approaches for working with Indigenous people include holistic approaches which work with Indigenous people in ways which take into account the full cultural, social, emotional, and economic context of their lives, including awareness of ongoing legacy and trauma, grief, and loss associated with colonisation. Having an active involvement of Indigenous communities in every stage of program development and delivery. Collaborative working relationships between government agencies and other relative organisations in delivering services and programs. Valuing Indigenous knowledge and cultural beliefs and practices, promoting positive cultural identity, having clear leadership and governance for programs, initiatives, and intervention, employing Indigenous staff and involving them fully in program design, delivery, evaluation, and providing adequate training, adopting a strength-based perspective that builds and develops the existing strengths, skills, and capacities of Indigenous people. Implications for my own personal practice framework would be that I may not be able to work in the field of Indigenous Australia due to the fact that I have not experienced the oppression and social disadvantages that Indigenous people face on a daily basis. One way of ensuring that I am skilled to work confidently with the Indigenous people is to undergo cultural awareness training. There are many great resources available to assist professionals working with Indigenous people to do so effectively and respectfully. I would need to advocate for Indigenous people. To be effectively allied, I would need to suspend my judgment to understand the wide range of issues which contribute to poverty by choice. I would need to be more aware of my own personal values and beliefs, as Indigenous people have their own culture and rules. It is recognised that poverty in Indigenous families is intergenerationally transmitted. This is likely due to the impacts of lack of quality education, with children living in poverty much more likely to continue to live in poverty throughout their lifetimes. Locational disadvantage, health problems, stigma, and discrimination. These factors create a cycle of disadvantages that become very difficult to break. Poverty and Indigenous people is therefore seen as another wicked problem, with policy solutions so far failing to make an impact. Poverty is just as real in our country for Indigenous Australians as it is in developing countries.